The castle appeared innocuous enough in the warm afternoon sun, and all seemed normal but for one thing. There were no birds singing.
Bram Stoker's Dracula is potentially the most adapted and reimagined story ever told, both in terms of direct adaptations of his novel and also in the ways that it shaped the way vampires would go on to be portrayed in media going forward. It's a simple concept with so much potential in it for expansion and different takes on the story, so it's no mystery why it's had the staying power that it did, and with early films like 1922's unofficial adaptation Nosferatu and the classic Universal Monsters take with Bela Lugosi's Dracula molding the way that the personality and appearance of vampires would go on to be handled, the significance of this story only continued to grow. Well, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula is seen by many as the best vampire movie ever made. There are still many who feel that in 1958, Christopher Lee delivered the best version of the character in Hammer Horror's Dracula, which is more commonly known now as Horror of Dracula since its release in the US extended the title out a bit to distinguish it more from the 1931 film. Hammer Productions' first film released in 1935, but it wouldn't be until 1955 that the studio began dipping their toes into the world of horror, setting the stage for them to breathe new life into these classic stories. The Quartermass Experiment was their first foray into the genre, with movies like The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 showing their interest in adapting older stories. In 1958, Hammer Horror's Dracula handed the character into the beautifully dark hands of one of the most iconic and well-respected actors to ever grace the screen, Sir Christopher Lee, who also just so happens to be one of the coolest people to ever live and was blessed with the voice of the gods.
The hour is later than you think.
Sauron's forces are already moving.
No, you're not as cool as Christopher Lee. I'm not as cool as Christopher Lee. You're not as cool as... No one's as cool. He's fucking Christopher Lee. While Ford Coppola's film is widely seen as the best adaptation of the story, most seem to be of the opinion that Lee's portrayal of the character of Dracula was the most refined, and it's also very difficult to top the iconic showdown between Peter Cushing and Sir Christopher Lee since both are horror royalty. While Horror of Dracula is by no means a faithful adaptation of Stoker's novel, the shifts that it made from the original story make it feel very justified and not like it was just a cash grab to try and build up the studio. This is a more intense, brutal, and fast-paced film than the previous adaptation, and is a pretty great representation of how Hammer's horror films were generally more edgy and dark than what had come before them at the time. There's a very distinct style to Hammer horror that is near and dear to my heart and makes me feel all warm and fuzzy with nostalgia, because these movies were what was often playing as we prepped the Halloween display every year when I was a kid. I've said before that Paranormal Activity was the first horror movie I saw, but I'm starting to think that was just what my young brain considered my first horror movie because I thought that was cool. And I think that young me may be full of shit because I was absolutely watching Hammer horror films well before I saw that movie. And like Jaws and Nosferatu and Universal Monsters for that matter. I don't know what I was thinking. So for this year's Halloween special, I thought it would be perfectly fitting to take a look at one of those formative horror films that helped establish my love for the genre and this time of year. And it's one that I absolutely cherish. So Jupiter and I would like to wish you all a very happy Halloween. And why don't we sit back and bask in the glory of one of those cozy classics. What? One of my favorite things about many movies from this era is how much of a statement they make with a really high intensity score greeting you from the first moment, and Horror of Dracula has one of my favorite examples of that. The calligraphy for the opening title card, along with the credits being accompanied by James Bernard's fantastic score, is such a gripping way to start things off, and it's a blessing that the movie itself absolutely lives up to that introduction. It also serves another purpose in establishing how Hammer's horror films were generally much more violent than much of what had come before by showing Dracula's name being drenched in blood, establishing that this take on the story is going to have a lot more of an edge to it. This is true in more ways than just the approach to the violence, because even the premise of where we pick up in the story is a more amplified take on that classic story. We meet Jonathan Harker, the protagonist in the novel as well as most adaptations, whose arrival at the castle is shown to have a cool spin on it when we learn that he's actually fully aware of the fact that Count Dracula is a vampire, and he's come to the castle with the intent to destroy him.
I will forever end this man's reign of terror.
I think this makes a lot of sense for a story that even at the time this came out was very well known culturally, because it allows for those familiar with the general narrative to feel right away that this version is going to be quite different from how you've known it to be. To be clear, I'm not saying that this is like a better take on the story or anything, but it's one that always got me excited because of how well it subverts your expectations within the first few minutes. It also implies a bit more of an action-packed story as opposed to the slow build-up that's usually present, and while I'm all for slow build-ups, I'm also all for upping the ante. That's not to say that this is some balls-to-the-wall Dracula film with no suspense or build-up or atmosphere or anything like that, because that's certainly not the case. Horror of Dracula is just much more interested in trying to focus on Van Helsing's pursuit and the battle with Dracula than it is on Harker's story. So much, in fact, that Harker is killed a little over 20 minutes into the movie. John Van Assen plays Jonathan, and I think that might have made it somewhat obvious that he was going to die fairly early on, or at least would play much less of a role this time around since Peter Cushing is on the poster, so when you see Harker being played by someone else, it definitely raises an eyebrow about how substantial he'll be. What I like about how they set this whole thing up is that we don't initially know that Harker is here to kill Dracula, as it plays the story fairly straight at first, with him arriving at the castle, talking with Valerie Gaunt, who played Justine in The Curse of Frankenstein the year prior, another movie with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, and is probably my favorite portrayal of the character of Victor Frankenstein himself. Anyway, it's not until Jonathan has talked with Count Dracula himself and is left alone in his room that we learn of his true intentions at the castle as he documents the day's events.
He accepts me as a man who has agreed to work among his books as I intended.
There's a little droplet indicating that something other than what we expect is going on here, as Jonathan isn't here to assist Count Dracula in buying a home in London, but instead he's apparently been brought on as the new librarian for the castle. It's just a nice little detail that serves as a little hint to saying we're doing something a little different here. As it turns out, Valerie Gaunt's character is a vampire, and after tricking Jonathan into coming close, she bites him before the Count himself intervenes and takes off with her. This sequence has a couple of some of the most iconic and well-crafted shots in all of horror, and I find it interesting to think about whether or not they knew on set at the time that they were dealing with money shots as powerful as the ones here. This is one of the best, Dracula sequences you're gonna find in any movie. Considering Jonathan's true intentions as a vampire hunter in this version, you'd think that he'd be a little more cautious than to let a woman held captive in the castle come close to him and his exposed neck like this, and it certainly calls into question his capabilities. But time's running out now after getting bit, and that odd moment does get remedied by a pretty damn cool scene of him writing his final wishes in the journal.
I can only pray that whoever finds my body will possess the knowledge to do what is necessary.
This cold open comes to a close when Harker seeks out the crypt in the night and puts a stake through the woman's heart, intending to do the same with Dracula, but finding that he snuck away now that night has fallen, and Harker's fate is sealed when Dracula makes his return. It's not a perfect cold open in terms of some of the contrivances and logic. There's no real reason given as to why Dracula didn't kill Jonathan when he had the chance, and there's the other thing that's certainly not exclusive to this movie, but was present in a lot of movies from the era where the time of day will shift way too quickly, but hey, it's still a damn cool subversion of expectations, and also gives a good introduction to Christopher Lee's Dracula, who won't get to show off the more human side of the character for the rest of the movie since he's being pursued as a known vampire the whole time. It's also worth noting that in this version he does not shapeshift at all, so he is just Dracula the whole time. That being said, the cold open is very successful at establishing that this is going to be a faster and more intense version of the story, with Harker being bitten within 15 minutes, placing him on a time limit right off the bat before being taken out and failing to accomplish his goals. I really love how after he takes out Valerie Gaunt's character, she rapidly ages, and we can take from this that this is how old she would have been had she never been cursed by Dracula to live in this cold eternity. It's a great misdirect here to have who we believe to be the main character of the film get killed off so early on, which raises the stakes and creates this great sense of unpredictability, like anyone can be taken out at any time. Lee's portrayal of Dracula is one of the most iconic, right up there with Bela Lugosi and more recently Gary Oldman, those three being what I would very comfortably consider to be the most iconic performances of Count Dracula to date. Max Schreck as Count Orlok Warlock is there as well, but despite the name being changed to Dracula in the 1947 public domain version of that movie, Warlock is quite a different version of the character, enough so that I'd separate them. This portrayal of Dracula is very deserving of all the accolades it gets, and while I'm not sure I can say I like his performance more than Gary Oldman's theatrical beauty in Ford Coppola's version, the clear spot and where Lee's take tops everything else is in the way he acts when Harker arrives, where I think he gives the most believable version of this aristocratic man isolated in his castle.
I consider myself fortunate to have found such a distinguished scholar to act as my librarian.
There's so much authority demanded of the character thanks to Lee's unbelievably potent presence on screen, and of course his voice goes a long way where that's concerned.
I must apologize for not being here to greet you personally, but I trust that you have found everything you needed.
To be clear, none of that is to say that Lee's performance is lacking in the later sections while he's showing more of the vampire than the human side, because that's certainly not the case. He's fantastic the whole way through, but it's more so that the script itself doesn't really ask much of him that would allow him to show off his capabilities here. Most of what works so well about Dracula in this movie is the way he's filmed and how he's utilized on screen, and it's less so about any particular actions he makes. Unless we're talking about like the close-up shots of him making faces like this, these are absolutely iconic and sheer perfection. It's a testament both to the direction from Terrence Fisher and Lee's ability to demand so much attention with little more than his presence and the look on his face that this depiction of the character has gone on to be as iconic as it has. A lot of that also does come down to the score from James Bernard helping to build up so much dark grandiosity around Dracula's presence, painting a vivid picture of the kind of evil we're dealing with before it's actually revealed in the movie. Coppola's Dracula movie still has the greatest score of any vampire movie ever. There are these little details in Lee's performance that show how much care and attention he has. One of the more notable ones for me is this little flex in his jaw when he's looking at the photo of Lucy while Jonathan is unpacking. More than likely not in the script, that little touch is a really chilling moment when you know the context of what he's thinking, and it sets up what's to come very well. Following that cold open, the remainder of the movie focuses on Van Helsing pursuing Dracula, while at the same time the Phantom of the Night is looking to seek revenge for his captive having been killed by taking Lucy for his own, and that take on the story is mostly what I'm talking about when I refer to this movie as being a more amplified version of Stoker's novel. Dracula wants vengeance here. He's not just coming to claim something he was drawn to, and in the same sense, Van Helsing wants vengeance for the death of Jonathan, who was a friend of his. One of the most legendary aspects of this movie is that we have two absolutely iconic horror actors facing off against one another, with Christopher Lee as Dracula and Peter Cushing in the role of Van Helsing. Cushing is absolutely fantastic in this movie, bringing this great elegant authority to the character without feeling like an emotionless and closed-off hunter. He's got some vulnerabilities, and I love how well the human side of the character comes out thanks to that warmth that Cushing is able to show throughout even the darkest moments of the story. One of my favorite elements in the story of Dracula that doesn't seem to get as much attention anymore in most adaptations is that we get to spend time seeing how Dracula's presence looms over the locals like an ancient ghost story. These details of garlic hanging on the ceiling in this inn, or people trying to sway travelers from going anywhere near the castle, it creates this haunting feeling surrounding Dracula, and it's something that I've always felt was done best in Hammer's take on the story, both in this and its sequel, Dracula Prince of Darkness. I think that part of that comes down to how charming I find the realizations of these small communities to be in these films, despite the general aggressiveness in the locals when it comes to outsiders. It just looks like a rather lovely spot to sit down and have a drink by a warm fire. I do have to acknowledge that a lot of my warm, fuzzy feelings about Hammer horror films comes from the immense nostalgia that I have for them, but I still think there's an inherently charming quality to their style even without that. There's such a strong fall vibe to the presentation, from the warm interiors with lots of saturated colors to the subtle burnt palettes in the forests. Then you've got some of the more surrealistic moments, like after Lucy is transformed and lures a young child into the forest with this eerie fog floating around the trees. She's in this flowing white gown that makes her look like a ghost glowing in the forest, and then there's a similarly ghostly feel to the scene when she almost turns the child but is interrupted. And I think that this scene alone right here, with the fog floating around the old stone architecture and the thin barren branches on some of the trees while others still have their leaves and make the courtyard feel like an overgrown abandoned castle while this creepily deformed vampire playfully drags a child along with her. I can very comfortably say that a lot of this movie's style played a huge part in forming my taste in horror. With this kind of presentation making Dracula's ancient gothic allure felt throughout the movie when he's not even around. That's not to mention how well he's handled when he is on screen, because the way that he's framed and lit in such an eerily intense fashion, with moments like when he appears in Lucy's window doing so much to create this dramatic flair. This is just a ridiculously atmospheric and artistic film that blends a naturalistic daylight look with this ethereal shift in the night, making the elevated danger of the moonlight come across perfectly. I could gush about the style of this movie forever, but I think you get the point. So back to the movie's narrative. One of the things that I really enjoy is how it makes Van Helsing's hunt for Count Dracula more personal by having Harker and him be friends, and it also makes Dracula's motivations more personal as well, since he's seeking revenge and targeting Lucy since her fiancé is the one who killed his captive. Van Helsing's discovery of Harker's body in the crypt at Dracula's castle at least means that he's able to fulfill Harker's dying wish that he won't be trapped to live in the curse, and in another twist on the original, when he returns home afterwards to inform Lucy of Jonathan's death, he finds her sick and is told not to tell her about what happened just yet. It's very sad to see her hanging on to the one thing that she feels will make her return to herself again, that being the return of Jonathan that she's unaware will never happen. However, we learn not long after that Lucy is already under Dracula's spell, and he's been feeding off of her, which is what's made her bedridden. I'd actually forgotten about this since it had been so long since I'd seen the movie, and I was genuinely hit by how sad her situation had become before feeling the tragedy of it even stronger when it's revealed that she's already gone. Lucy's storyline has always been one soaked with tragedy and a really unsettling feeling of being preyed upon, which is tied directly into one of the core ideas in the character of Dracula, that being that vampires were often used to evoke fears of sexuality, which is something that's absolutely explored in many horror stories, but when you had this aristocratic, done-up monster seducing people and taking them into his captivity by biting their necks, and then have them be portrayed in what was considered much more intimate and private clothing at the time, it's pretty clear how this story is used to try and raise those ideas of how giving into sexuality transforms people into these sickly beings. I didn't intentionally make multiple consecutive videos talking about movies that evoke a fear of sexuality, but sometimes things just happen. Maybe this is just my taste in movies. Anyway, there's something about the way that Lucy's storyline plays out here that I find especially tragic even when compared to many of the others, because there's such a strong sense of hopelessness and a cold evil directed towards her that makes it really rough. While Coppola's film deviated pretty heavily from the novel in this aspect, there's at least the notion that she may actually be the reincarnation of the love that he lost, and she's drawn to him because of that ancient love that never truly died. And in Browning's 1931 film, the character is saved from the curse at the end. But in this version of the story, she meets a much bleaker fate. By the time we meet her, she's already totally under the sickly spell of Dracula, and her whole world revolves around waiting for him to come and drain her of more of her life in the night. And so when Van Helsing demands that garlic bouquets be placed by her bedside and that the windows remain shut throughout the night, she becomes completely erratic once the sun sets. She pleads for the maid to remove them, who after some reluctance agrees because she doesn't want Lucy to be so upset given her state already being so unpleasant, and the next morning Lucy is found dead in her bed. There's something so unsettling about watching someone who was in love and to be married have her whole existence be turned into waiting for a monster to come and drain the life out of her, and we literally watch her beg to have those protections removed so that the violation can continue and ultimately take her life. This isn't necessarily unique to this adaptation, but it's portrayed in a particularly sickly way here that really gets under my skin, and it's another way that the movie makes it clear that nobody is safe. I will say there is one issue I have with how this plays out, and that's that everyone who's assessed Lucy's health noticed the bizarre bite marks on her neck, but never made the connection that they could somehow be part of her declining health, which they now say is anemia. Van Helsing, of course, made the connection immediately, but it seems to me that the doctors probably would have made some sort of connection before that. Now, if the marks were more subtle, I might believe that a little more, but considering this movie has maybe the most nasty looking vampire bite marks I've seen, it's absolutely insane to see these doctors just disregard this glaring thing. You think that bite marks on her neck could perhaps be connected to her anemia, but hey, I'm not a doctor. They fucking are though. I remember as a kid watching this movie and being so freaked out by how gnarly those bite marks look. They're just these like ugly, swollen things that just look uncomfortable and infected and gross. Ugh. Now I'm painting a pretty bleak picture of the movie's vibe, but there is actually a lot of levity in the tone with comic relief moments like this lovely dude here.
Oh! Hey!
This poor guy. They just keep coming back. My favorite is probably this dude who tries to help Van Helsing track down a coffin that went missing. He's absolutely hilarious, solely because of how ridiculously over the top his performance is.
Perhaps you better let me lead the way. I know these steps, they can be dangerous. An old man came here once to see his dear departed, and he fell down these stairs.
The humor doesn't take away from the tone or the immersion of the film. It complements the overall narrative very well because it doesn't feel like forced in humor. It just feels like there are some people who happen to cross paths with the events who can get a good chuckle out of you. The Doctor is also hilarious.
Under no circumstances may an unauthorized person be permitted to examine. Of course, in the case of an emergency.
I was like genuinely like belly laughing throughout many of these scenes. There was another moment that had me chuckling quite a bit, although I think it was unintentional in this case. We've got this young girl who's really scared after encountering Lucy when she died, and the way that Mina talks to her is so fucking mean, man.
And then someone came along, and she ran away and left me, and I was wrong.
Now, you don't want Mr. Holmwood to think you're a crybaby, do you?
Why? It's a kid, man. This shit's scary. With Lucy and Jonathan both dead, the film of course has to shift focus onto some of the new characters to have alongside Van Helsing in his pursuit, and that's where Lucy's brother Arthur and his wife Mina come in. Not completely new characters, mind you, but their roles in the story are certainly emphasized more. Mina is still turned into a vampire, and she winds up harboring Dracula in their wine cellar just beneath their feet, but when they get down there, they find out Dracula has already left with her. Now not having Lucy as his bride since Van Helsing put a stake through her heart before he could leave with her, and taking Mina in her place. The final confrontation between Van Helsing and Dracula is just awesome, and no, that's not just because of how much I nerd out watching Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing face off in a gothic castle. Shut up! It's because of how fucking sick it is to watch Van Helsing hop up on the table, run across it, and jump to grab the curtain and pull it down, exposing the Count to the sunlight and causing him to deteriorate into nothing but ash with this fantastic effect. The movie is full of a lot of really great practical effects, some of which definitely push the boundaries of violence for the 50s, particularly when Lucy is put to rest by Van Helsing with a stake. By today's standards, this is nothing, but you can bet that at the time this was very shocking, and it still looks pretty damn good despite how comically bright red the blood is. The thing that really stood out to me though is the burn marks on Mina's hand when she holds the crucifix after having been turned by Dracula. That looks really damn good. But yeah, Dracula is turned into ash by the warmth of the sun, and the movie closes on his ring laying on the floor with what remains of the beast next to it. Well, Bernard's incredible score returns once again to send off the film. Despite being far from a faithful adaptation of the novel, Horror of Dracula is without a doubt one of the best takes on Stoker's novel ever put to film. The style of Terence Fisher's phenomenal direction melds with the all-time performances from Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and that tonal blending of unsettling gothic horror with some great humor makes for a really cozy watch that is very much so unique to Hammer's horror films. The final note that I took while preparing this video was simply, this movie fucks. And yeah, that about sums up my feelings on it. It's a wonderfully atmospheric and fun film that absolutely flies with this fast-paced and bleaker take on the story, and it's also the home to some of the most iconic images of Dracula's character. I'll never let an October pass without watching this one. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.